practitioners from engineering firms under the DAR group, in which we're gonna put the hat of the practitioners in the government, from the investor community, and from the buyers of these built environment houses and facilities. And we're gonna explore questions around what does it take to make it happen. So the way we'll operate this panel is that I'll invite each of the panelists to give an opening remark from their field around what they are doing. Then they will join me together to go through some of the questions where it will explore some solutions. First, I would love to invite Balsam Nami, who leads the sustainability practice in DAR, to give us her opening remarks.
Do you have a pointer to move the slides? Okay. Thank you, Yahya. So we know that we are in a climate crisis. We know that there are a lot of contributions from human activity in rising the greenhouse gas emissions, which is impacting our initial targets for mitigating environmental emissions and for limiting to get to the 1.5-degree target that we had initially set. But we also know that there are solutions to cater for those increases. And hence why we have developed our mission for us and a vision to align with sustainability. From building sustainably to decarbonizing the built environment altogether towards net zero developments. Some facts about the climate change that we're speaking to is that the last decade was the hottest in 125,000 years. The ocean absorbs most of the heat that we produce, and CO2 levels are really at their highest since 2 million years from now. On the next slide, you'll see that our planet could become too hot to live in some places by the end of the century. And because of this, we have lost 300 billion working hours to excessive heat in 2019 alone. The rate of sea level rise has tripled since 1971, and we are also losing 1.2 trillion tons of ice each year. So all of this does lead to all of the significant problems that are associated with climate change. But there are solutions to this. Our solutions start by cut down on emissions with a target of 50% reduction per decade to get to our net zero ultimate target by 2050, which is our point of discussion today. The decarbonization solution as well, and the importance of digitization as an enabler for climate mitigation and taking effective climate action. So how do we set the sequence to net zero? So there are a lot of talks about how we get to net zero, but first and foremost, we have to understand where are the emissions coming from before we start getting to net zero. So buildings alone are responsible for more than half of the global emissions that we emit. And the materials that are within the building, they're responsible for around 23% of the total global emissions. Having said that, it's important to decarbonize not only our operations, but the way that we construct our buildings, the materials that we choose for our buildings specifically. Just one example that you'll see on the next slide is the choice of materials and how important it is in terms of reducing our embodied carbon. Just a brief example of and definition of what embodied carbon is. It is the energy that's associated with the extraction of different materials, their transport, their manufacturing, building those materials until the end of life, and then their demolition and dismantling. And if you see some example, timber is probably in the lowest. Aluminum and fiberglass that we use for a lot of our insulation is in the highest, which means that we'll have, when we speak about net zero, we'll have to really think specifically of the materials that we choose to build moving forward. So that gets us to the sequence to net zero. So the sequence to net zero, as you see here, has two approaches. There are two tiers to the net zero targets. First is on the operational, and second is on the embodied carbon. And if we move to the next slide, and you do see here the contributions of each, there's a significant contribution of operational energy that you could see to the right in the orange color, and then also a very significant contribution to the embodied energy. And that's why our solutions need to tackle both together in a whole life carbon approach. The next slide shows how the sequencing to net zero really should happen and how we should drive it towards our targets. From the operational side of things, so first and foremost, as architects, as engineers, and as an AEC consultancy, we think passively. So what are the low-hanging fruits? What are the solutions that are available out there that are easy to implement first, that gets us to reduce our consumption before we start implementing the different systems that actively would consume on energy? But when we do, and because we have to, we do need cooling, for example, in the Gulf, we'll have to think about the most efficient systems that we want to integrate within our buildings and our built environment. From the mechanical to the electrical systems and all of the components that we build with and that we operate our buildings with. So that gets us to really reducing our energy consumption to target energy use indices that are set globally depending on the different climates and the different applications. And then once we have reduced, that's when we offset. We don't offset, we don't use renewables unless we have, first and foremost, taken the path towards reduction of our operations. Second path is the grid decarbonization and how important it is across the different governments and entities to support the idea of grid decarbonization, because when we speak about emissions, we speak about scope 1 and scope 2 emissions. So that's what we are responsible for. So our own emissions operating a building, for example, electricity, gas, etc. And secondly, it's what the electricity and the source of electricity that we get. So it's about the grid decarbonization and the impact this has on our operations. Secondly, it's about the embodied carbon. So how we transform, how we reuse whenever we can, obviously, how we build less, build clever, build efficiently, and then how we minimize waste. So we always try, and that's how it should be, setting targets towards waste reduction in terms of construction waste. So not only focus on the operational side of things, but also integrate the embodied side of things as well. And then lastly is to think about the certified offsets to offset the whole emissions that we do have. So having said that, you can see here the different building blocks of a low carbon economy. And it does have several players to it, from the private funders to the governmental entities, and also the importance of availability of data and technology-driven decisions to get us to net zero. Thank you.
Thank you, Balsam. Next, I would like to invite Faisal Shar on stage to give his opening remark on the role of digital capabilities to unlock the decarbonization potential in the built environment. Faisal leads the digital practice at DAR, and he also leads PARA, that is the digital twin of DAR. Please, Faisal.
So I'm going to start and talk about the digital twin, and it's how it can be an accelerant for sustainability initiatives. A digital twin is a virtual representation of a physical asset, process, or system that can be used to model, visualize, predict a certain physical asset. So in this case, when we're talking about buildings, what we do is we integrate with the different building systems in order to create a digital copy of that asset. Once we have that digital copy, the digital twin in the bottom, that's when we analyze the data generated over there and add enough context to understand how the building is performing and which are the underperforming areas in the building, the overall health. Once we do that, we have another link from the cognitive layer to the physical building, that bidirectional link, where we can basically come up with interventions and recommendations. So buildings produce a lot of data, all kinds of buildings, right? There's a misconception or misperception about buildings in general. The problem with the data and buildings and the building space is that there's a very high degree of fragmentation in terms of the systems that are in the building. They're all disjointed. So what a digital twin can do is basically act as that digital thread that weaves together all these disparate systems and put everything in one place and build enough context about what's going on. And by doing that, we can really start to understand what's going on in the facility, right? And what are the opportunities for us to reduce carbon emissions. This is just a quick, just showing you all the building sources. And if we were to look at an average size building, it would fill up about 2 iPhones a month just because of how much data it produces. That's a lot of data, and we can definitely capitalize on all that data in the building. So looking at the built environment and just breaking it down by sector, we see that the building sector makes up about 28% of carbon emissions in the built environment, right? And most of that is coming from emissions during the post-construction phase, during operations and maintenance. And that's why with a digital twin, where it's all about data, we're targeting this dark blue spot over here. Again, this is showing the whole life carbon of a typical building, where we see a spike during construction. So that starts at year 1, continues until year 3, and that usually makes up about 15% of the emissions. The rest happens after year 2.5, when the building is operational, and keeps going for the next 50 years. So with the digital twin platform, if we're able to reduce that by 10% and hold it steady for 50 years, it can make a very big difference. So we look at operational performance, and we do 3 things over there. We describe what's going on, right? And that's what we can do with all the data and adding context. We predict what's going to happen in the facility. And the third one is we come up with recommendations. So it becomes prescriptive. And that's the value of a digital twin. It's not just about reporting on your ESG. It's about finding the right carbon reduction strategies and then putting them in motion and tracking progress. This is one example of what we can do in a building, and something we've done is we use machine learning to simulate how the building is supposed to respond, which is the green curve down here. So the blue curve is how it's actually operating. Green curve is the ideal. In the ideal scenario, if you had the right HVAC units on and the right lights on, we could be consuming this amount. And if we keep going, the way we do this is we look at impacting factors, things that can impact your consumption. So the first one is obviously we want to understand the space really well. We want to know what the level of occupancy is, which parts of the building are being used, and we use machine learning to understand these occupancy patterns. Outdoor conditions, indoor conditions. And then we need to have a very good understanding of the MEP model. So we take everything over here, we put it together, and using machine learning and our engineering expertise, our domain knowledge, we can trace this green curve and then spot exactly where the opportunities are to improve operational spending. And this takes me to the second thing we did. And this is fundamentally different from the operational performance gap, which refers to how you're operating the building. In this case, we're talking about how the building is designed, so the building performance. And what we do as designers in the early stage is we look at all these different factors that affect building efficiency: massing, shape, envelope, performance, glazing, distribution. Once we run our energy models, right, and submit our designs, a lot happens between then and when the building is up and running. And what the digital twin can do is really look at that divergence between what we expected and what actually happened. So outcome and expectation, and really find out what went wrong in the building. Thank you.
Finally, I'd like to invite Richard Palmer, who's the climate change and sustainability lead at Integral. Please.
Thank you so much. Hello, everyone. We have something of a challenge in front of us in the built environment. We have a sector that is profoundly impacting the world and impacting the climate. Now, the task at hand has been given to us by science. The blue curve on that slide is the IPCC 1.5 degree trajectory. That is the decarbonization task if we are going to keep climate to no more than 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. What that chart entails is a 50% reduction in global greenhouse gas emissions by the end of this decade, net zero emissions by 2050, and net negative emissions over the back half of the century. That is quite simply a question of atmospheric physics. That is how the concentration of greenhouse gas emissions in our atmosphere need to change if we are going to constrain the greenhouse effect to no more than 1.5 degrees. What does this mean for us, though, in the built environment? We exist in a net of systems of transportation, a net of systems of energy, a net of systems of concrete and steel, importantly, a net of systems of people. And it is this set of relationships that are in transition at the moment. When we speak of an urban transition, we speak of the changes that are happening in our cities and the change in things that we need to design and engineer. So if we could move to the next slide, I think it's important that we understand how systems relate to each other. When I started this gig, when I sort of put on my green building boots, we spoke about buildings a great deal. We spoke about green buildings, and we had a whole suite of principles, a whole suite of ideas about what would make a green building. However, green buildings don't get us there on their own, because the buildings exist in relationship to transport, they exist in relationship to energy, they exist in relationship to water, and they exist in relationship to waste. And so if we're going to talk about climate action, we cannot, in all seriousness, consider a decarbonization pathway aligned with science if we do not look at the built environment in an integrated way, if we do not consider buildings and infrastructure together when we think about net zero. It's not just climate. The same is true if we think about health and well-being. For instance, if we think about air quality, if you ask a mechanical engineer about air quality, and I'm a mechanical engineer, so I should know, what you'll hear is talk about filtration systems, you'll hear talk about indoor environmental quality, you'll hear talk about possibly natural ventilation. And that will be our professional response to this idea of air quality. The biggest impacts on air quality in the world's cities are as a result of burning fossil fuels to generate energy and the combustion engines of transport vehicles. And so if we are serious about changing the health and well-being of our cities, if we're serious about improving air quality, we have to remove combustion from the built environment, which is also a climate issue. And so we don't solve climate, we don't solve health and well-being. The same is true for supply chains and the resource economy if we only look at building systems or we only look at buildings. The whole idea only works when we look at buildings and infrastructure together. If we could move to the next slide, one of the challenges we face, though, is that our governance, particularly in the infrastructure sector, is quite poor when it comes to sustainability. So in the building space, the green building movement, represented here by the countries shaded in green, those are all countries with green building councils. They're all countries with green building rating tools. we can define green buildings really, really well in all of the green countries. The green countries aren't really where we're going to be building, though. The circles on that picture represent the future growth in the built environment. So Architecture 2030 suggests that we are still going to build another 230 billion square meters of buildings and all of the infrastructure that's going to support them. And we can see that that growth by 2060, which is the outside circle, compared to the dark inside circle, is biggest in Africa, is biggest in Southern Asia, and in Asia Pacific broadly. And those are the places where we have the least governance around net zero or sustainability. When we look at infrastructure, we only really know or have good frameworks for sustainable infrastructure in North America. So these are the circles. The light blue is the CEQUAL rating. The dark blue is the CEQUAL rating, light blue is the Envision rating, and yellow is the infrastructure sustainability rating. It's only in Australia, New Zealand, Europe, and North America that we have clear frameworks, consistent benchmark frameworks for sustainability and infrastructure. So we have something of a challenge. If we need to decarbonize the entire built environment, and buildings and infrastructure are intimately connected and cannot be solved one without the other, and the future growth has where we see future growth has very little governance around net zero at all. The green buildings are relatively well represented, but sustainable infrastructure is almost unheard of. This presents a market failure and something that we as a professional industry, a professional peer group, a professional practice need to engage quite seriously so that we have clear, benchmark, transparent principles that allow us to decarbonize everything, everywhere. If we could move on to the final slide. I got asked for my key priorities in how we deliver upon this decarbonization challenge in the built environment. And the things that I came to were, we need to electrify everything. If it moves, if we build it, we need to think about how it can be electrified. Some things can't, mind. And so those things that can't, particularly things that require some level of combustion, we need to think about hydrogen. But in many ways, hydrogen is just an intermediary for electricity. Hydrogen sits between a renewable energy generator and an end use that cannot be effectively electrified. So let's put hydrogen in with the electrify everything. We have to think about whole life carbon. So a lot of what we do when we think about operational carbon and electrifying everything as well, it deals with a big chunk. And we saw in Faisal's presentation how much of the operational stage contributes, but it doesn't contribute everything. And as we drive the operational stage down with the clean grid and electrification, so the embodied, the carbon embedded in the materials starts to dominate. So we have to consider whole life carbon. Then we need to recognize that because we build this 230 billion square meters of buildings and its associated infrastructure, it's very unlikely that we're going to stop building. It would seem nonsensical in many ways that we are going to stop building. And so we need to think about that residual impact. Once we've dealt with as much embodied as we can and as much operational as we can, we need to understand how land and carbon and biodiversity work together and are woven together so that we can start to build the kinds of markets that protect and restore the natural world that withdraws and draws down carbon out of the atmosphere and embeds it back into the earth. Ooh. The fourth thing is we need to think about resilience and how we invest. Because we're not going to, even at 1.5 degrees, even if we stick to the most plausible low carbon trajectory that we have, we are still going to have larger and more frequent climate impacts than we have had historically. And how we invest, firstly, in the kinds of infrastructure that will mitigate climate risk, but I think even more importantly, how we think about the places that we protect and the places that we do not protect. It is inevitable that there will be sacrifices. and that those sacrifices will have impacts in investment and in asset ownership. And so building a very sophisticated view of what and how we protect within the built environment as the inevitability of some level of climate change starts to take effect. The final priority from me is to advocate. We see a huge advocacy gap, particularly from the professional services sector in the built environment. We have seen very strong advocacy from some sectors of industry. We have seen particularly strong advocacy from civil society, and there's a great deal of climate protest at the moment. And we have these two worlds of business advocacy for the status quo and quite strident, in some cases populist advocacy for rapid change. Where there is a huge gap is in professional advocacy. It's in the informed professional view that acknowledges the science. As engineers, we are bound by science. It is the first part of becoming an engineer. We do math and physics and chemistry. We understand that atmospheric physics is it's non-negotiable. However, we also act in the world of business, and we also act in the world of construction. And most importantly, we have carriage of the real built things. And that gives us insight that is unparalleled in what this transition might look like. We design the energy systems, we design the transportation systems, we design the buildings, we design the places where people live. And so largely, if we're talking about balanced, informed, pragmatic, plausible advocacy, that's going to have to fall to us, because I don't see anybody else picking it up at the moment. So that's it for me. I think we're going to have a bit of a chat now. So I'd like to thank you for your attention. And on we go. Shall I just take a seat?
Thank you so much for these informative presentations. And if I may pick up from the themes that Balsam and Richard covered, clearly we're going to build more. The question is, do we see more investments towards regeneration of existing buildings, or is it going to be all greenfields?
So when we're speaking about the built environment, we try not to differentiate as much as we can between the new and the existing. When we set our targets should be to tackle both. So we're interested in getting to net zero across the built environment, the ones that are already existing, and hence why we're relying a lot on data and on the digital aspect of things to really support this, and the ones that are yet to be built as well. Now, it depends really on the different regions that we operate in, but globally speaking, there is importance to the existing and the retrofitting sector, as much as there should be importance to the greenfield sector or the new builds that we are looking at.
There's obviously going to be both. Renewal of the existing built environment is going to be a substantive part of how people continue to inhabit cities and develop cities. But urbanization continues strongly across the world. It has been a trend for 4,000 years that people have moved towards cities, from the very earliest cities in Syria. I think Aleppo is the oldest city in the world. And so as people agglomerate, as they move to cities, we will continue to build new. And that trend of urbanization, I think about a decade ago, we went past 50%, but we show no signs of stopping. In the most urbanized countries in the world, 90% of people live in built-up areas, and globally it is substantially less than that. So if our human population continues to grow, and if people continue moving to cities, we are going to continue to build. And so the challenge, I think, is a fundamental one. We're not going to just regenerate our way out of this challenge.
Thank you. Thanks, Richard. From a digital perspective, do you see the application of the digital twins in the greenfield environment in the new buildings, or also are there applications in existing buildings?
I think what we're seeing right now with digital twins is both of them are fair game. The approach is very different, specifically with digital twins, whether it's a new building or old one. By far, the biggest problem or the biggest challenge when it comes to digital twins is integrating with the different systems you have in a building. Older buildings have systems with different communication protocols that aren't as open. Newer ones, you have newer systems over there. And especially if you're designing it, then you can make sure that the building is designed in a way so that it facilitates digital twin integration and you can get the platform running. But to that point, I think we need to have an approach for the brownfield, for the older buildings, because they're still going to be in our portfolio 30, 40 years from now. So we need.
And from a technology maturity perspective, do you see that we need to invest more in research and development around digital twinning? And are we getting that? Do you see the money flowing into that direction?
I think in this case, what we're seeing right now is market acceptance is what drives entrepreneurship in this space, and that attracts funding. And we haven't seen enough market acceptance, so people have embraced the concept, but they're not convinced when you actually start scratching, right? They embraced it, but that hasn't translated into market acceptance, and that's a prerequisite for adoption right now. And the problem we're seeing specifically in the digital twin space is that the people who are driving the conversation are the technology providers and not the domain experts, not the subject matter experts. So they're trying to come up with solutions to problems and pain points that aren't really in their sector or circle of knowledge. And that's why people aren't convinced. They haven't seen compelling use cases that can actually translate into an ROI. So I think we need to fix that problem, have the domain experts emerge from the sideline, and then once clients are convinced, we're going to see demand pick up, and we're going to see an entire ecosystem grow as a result of that.
Okay. If I go back to the holistic view of the built environment and the financing, and put the hat of government, you spoke about standards being like not cohesive. Different countries are adopting others. So, Richard, what should the government do? What are gaps in public investment? Any blind spots to focus on?
Wow. What should government do? So, I mean, there are things that government does well. There are things government is well set up to do. Government can take risk better than the private sector can take risk on balance. The government is well set up to manage risk. We speak about co-investment, and government is well set up because of its risk appetite, its capacity for risk, to lead investment that can crowd in private capital and de-risk private capital. So an example of this could be if you look at the transition of an electricity system. We know that the investment case for wind and solar is very, very strong. The price is low, it's very competitive. The big constraint on wind and solar is our grid design and the access that those projects have to an energy market. So governments are very well set up to, for instance, grow renewable energy zones and build the grid infrastructure that allows private investment in the generation infrastructure to be brought to market and brought online. So that's something that government can do, is understand where its investment is most likely to crowd in private capital into the transition. Government can also lead through its own procurement. Government builds a lot. And so if we talk about the importance of net zero, for instance, government can make net zero a prerequisite for suppliers and for projects. And in that sense, it can send a signal to the professional services market and to the construction market about what it values. So government can use its purchasing power, it can use its risk appetite, and I think those are the two ways that, those are perhaps the two biggest levers I would say that government has. But then policy and regulation are obviously of critical importance as well. So at conferences like this, commitments will be made, and broad policy levers can be put in place that stimulate certain sectors, the electric vehicle sector or the heat pump sector, or there are a whole range of things that just through good public policy, government can nudge nudge development across the board. And so I think there we go. So if we say policy plus regulation, strategic investment to crowd in as a result of its risk appetite, and public procurement.
Thank you. Balsam, if I go to you, you are one of the largest employers in the engineering sector. How do you see the youth is being prepared, or the existing capabilities are being prepared to pivot, to integrate decarbonization in the design, in the execution, and throughout?
So in terms of the youth, if we are to talk about that side of things, it's the most important aspect to it is awareness. And you do see, like, for example, for us, we've been doing on an annual basis what's called the Green Apple Day of Service. The Green Apple Day of Service is a program that tackles several schools across the Middle East. And it does cover about thousands of students to date. What we've seen, as we've been doing this for the past 10 years, what we've seen progress is the way the youth is observing sustainability and the way the youth is attending to sustainability. And that has significantly progressed 10 years ago until today. And we expect that this would be a driving force for the way that we do our business moving forward. And the reason for this is that there is much more demand, there's much more focus, and there's much more importance to building sustainably coming from the younger generation first and foremost. So answering your question, yes, I think they would act as the driving force. They would help us on our mission to integrate sustainability, and they would help us really drive the industry further towards the net zero target that we've been speaking of.
And do we see academia and the educational institutions preparing the talent for that, or there is an effort?
There definitely is. And if you go to the universities, for example, so if you look at the different curriculums with the universities that we've been working with, and there are several MOUs that we've signed with universities, hence their importance to really work with companies that work on sustainability and that drive sustainability and that prioritize sustainability, is that even within the programs that the academia is really working on, sustainability is becoming a built-in aspect of what they teach for their students. So that does complement the idea of really having the youth and the different, from the schools to the universities moving forward, drive this task force forward.
Richard, any addition from you, Faisal?
Just tying this to digital and entrepreneurship, and many of the good ideas come from young people. And what we're seeing in the built environment space, and what's really challenging, is it's recognized to be lagging other sectors in terms of digital transformation, right? So that's known. And most of the stakeholders are used to the systems and their methods and what they've been doing for many years. So the barriers to entry for digital solutions are very, very, very high right now. And we're starting to see that change with everything happening around ESG and how the regulatory landscape is changing, right? They need to change their methods, and they start turning to innovative solutions like digital.
I think we have a global challenge that's generational. I know there's a lot of talk amongst millennial and whoever came next, I forget.
Generation Z.
But
yes.
there's a sense of hopelessness and apathy that's born of hopelessness when it comes to this issue of climate. I think we see real challenges in engagement. We see, I think, a lot of resignation, a lot of mistrust, a lot of, I think just a recognition of a general failure of leadership. And again, when we talk about, now that manifests in different ways. On the one hand, we see a lot of future talent who put values at the front of their decisions of where to work. So at a professional level, being able to signal our leadership, being able to signal our understanding and our engagement with these key issues is one of those areas. But I think we also need to get much, much better at telling a hopeful story, because there are many people, and I guarantee you there are many people.
Okay, use this one.
Magic. No, I was just saying there are plenty of people in this conference. There are going to be plenty of doomsayers. There are going to be plenty of people who say we are not able to move fast enough. We are not able to do what we need to do, that we have already failed. And that is a narrative that I've already heard. And I think amongst the engineering profession, within the built environment, we need to get much better at saying, yes, it is difficult. Yes, it is a mountain to climb. Yes, it is a challenge that is of a scale that we have never before scaled, but we have not yet failed. It is not yet over. The solutions exist. We know how to do this. We can engineer this. We've put people on the moon. We've built the Webb Space Telescope and looked to the edge of the universe. We know how to do this, and we can offer people hope. And I think in many ways it is incumbent on the engineering profession to be the bringers of hope.
Hopefully. Richard, staying with you, and if I shift gears to the investors, are they seeing the business case? Like, if we look at the carbon markets, while molecular-wise it's the same, but given the carbon markets across the world, it's not really the same when it comes to the business case. So do we need more innovative funding mechanisms? Do we need other funding solutions in order to unlock the private sector potential? Or you see that happening already?
There's a lot in that. Carbon markets, highly variable globally. Many organizations choose to price carbon. A lot of the investor response to carbon pricing is picked up in their overall climate risk management, and the TCFD, the Task Force for Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, has gone a long way to bringing a level of global consistency to that risk, particularly carbon price risk for many investors. And the work done, I don't know when, a few years ago by Carbon Tracker, they were the first ones to create the idea of the carbon bubble. Essentially that there are at-risk investments embedded across the financial sector, in equities, in debt products, in every financial instrument. There is exposure to the transition, exposure to this urban transition in many ways, the energy, the transportation transition, the future technology will be different, and also direct asset exposure to climate events. Now, investors have come to see that as a real risk. It's not a marketing effort. It's not it's not something that you just say. the insurers particularly, and the superannuation funds with very long-term investments now have to see climate risk as real risk. And that means they have to price it. And I think what we're seeing is outside of carbon markets, we're actually seeing the risk pricing of climate rather than the carbon pricing of climate. And that many investors are now de facto, because of their disclosure obligations under TCFD, are starting to much more accurately price risk and are either disposing of assets or changing their asset acquisition strategy towards a different mix of investments. And I think more so than a particular business case around this building or that bridge, I think what we're seeing is across whole portfolios of assets, much more sophisticated decision making from investors about where they choose to put their capital.
Thank you. And if I move to the execution, for you, Balsam, is the supply chain ready? Are your suppliers ready to take this on?
So there are two sides to this question. First is the suppliers, second is the operators in terms of readiness. So some of the suppliers are, some still aren't, and that's what we're working towards, part of the advocacy program that we're onboarding. So what I mean is that and that's from a Middle Eastern and African perspective. So we do see that the market's picking up. It's not picking up at the speed that we would want it throughout. It's not equally picking up. If you do take some regions of the Middle East, you will see that the suppliers are all ready. They're aligned with international targets. They're aligned with international action plans, while other part of the region are really still falling behind and falling behind significantly. So there's really a gap, and this gap needs to be bridged eventually. That's on the supply side of things, and that's what we're working on. We're working with understanding the market maturity. We're working with seeing how we can influence from lessons learned from one market into another market to really kind of broaden the suppliers' ability to assist in climate mitigation throughout our regions and the regions that we operate in. In terms of the operators, there's also a gap here, and that's very important because you cannot go implement sophisticated, innovative systems if you don't have the right people to operate them. It just does not make sense. So that's really another aspect that we would like to look at and to focus on, not only the supply chain to be available for this, but also the FM and the operational team to be ready to deal with those systems, to ensure that they're as efficient as possible throughout the lifetime of the building and throughout the lifetime of the systems that we're installing.
Very interesting. And I'm assuming digital is part of that.
Exactly.
So Faisal, your reflections, like, do you have the suppliers, and on the operations side, once you're handing over the digital twinning capabilities, are you finding the operators taking them on and running with them?
I think in this case, it's there's definitely a skill set gap. There's an expertise gap. But what we're seeing specifically with digital twins, which is interesting, is that it's cloud-based. So when it comes to maintaining a digital twin, and most of the digital solutions out there are cloud-based right now. So whether it's an ESG tool to help you with your disclosures, and they're very, very helpful these days because you have different jurisdictions and countries, and they have different disclosure requirements. ESG metrics are becoming more granular, so you need to look at more data sources. So the existing building systems are good for macro level aggregate ESG figures, but when you go deep, like with the new legislation being proposed, they're going to have to think about using digital solutions, and most of these are cloud-based. So in terms of using these new solutions, it's relatively easy. Because they're on the cloud, it can be maintained. In terms of data hosting, that's something you don't even have to worry about as well. Where we see a gap specifically isn't in maintaining or operating these tools, but really maximizing the benefit, right? Because they're used to their old workflows, and these new digital solutions are very disruptive, and it's just getting a hand of them and adapting to them is what they need to do.
And when we're thinking of the design, maybe Richard, to you, what should be the design priorities before we move into the operations?
I think I think the obvious answers are electrification, whole life carbon, zero emissions projects, embedding clear technical handover for operational performance for high-performing assets. I think in many ways that's the sort of stock answer for the role of designers. We need to do the thinking work to put the systems in place that get us onto a high-performance pathway. But I think about it a little bit more sort of philosophically than that, because design is the creative end of the spectrum. Design is it's the part of the process. I mean, I'll tell you what, in strategy and business case and planning, you go to a formula. Like at the strat end, creativity is not really the key currency. And equally, once you go to construction and handover, like the margins for creative problem solving again start to narrow substantially. And so if we're going to come up with something new as an industry, if we're going to do stuff that we have not done before, and I think everything that we've spoken to would suggest that we have to do stuff that we have not done before, then the creativity to do that new stuff is going to happen in design. And so I think that bringing creative problem solving back to the built environment is probably the single biggest thing that designers need to get their heads around. And yes, obviously, delivering net zero ready or zero emissions ready built environment projects is one outworking of that.
Like, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to add one very important aspect of the design, which is the integrated approach aspect of the design that makes it successful. Like, you'll need to have everyone sitting together for that creativity to happen and for that delivery to be successful. Like, not only the designer, but you also need to be listening to your client. You need to be taking your contractor on board. You'll need to be taking on board your stakeholders, your end users. Everyone needs to be sitting around the same table for your design to come out really as a successful design that you would be delivering.
It seems like we have a really long way to go to prepare the youth, to get the suppliers on board, to prepare the operators. Who should take the lead? Is it something for the governments? Is it for the investors? Is it for the private sector? What's your view on who should be taking the lead?
So there was a discussion previously that we were all involved in, and there was a great point that said that consumers take the lead. So all of them, they do take part in this, but the question about who's leading, it's where the demand comes from. So you see that when there's high demand for something, everyone runs to do it. When there's low demand for something, no one wants to do it. So however the market is driven, what the demand is looking for, and what it really aims to really maximize in terms of requirements is what would be leading. But again, I'm still back to my point that I mentioned earlier this morning, is that it's not a one-man show again. It's everybody that has to play a role. The governments need to put in regulations. They need to incentivize people. The financial sector also has a role to play, as well as the other different stakeholders, from the youth to the different communities, to the consultants, contractors, and others that do play a significant role in this.
Yeah. Like, go ahead. Do you want to jump?
Oh, sure. So from my perspective, the way I think it's the entire cycle that matters. Everyone is part of it, but it should be a self-reinforcing cycle. And it can either be the consumers, so consumers can be the instigators, or it can be government. And just going back to the ESG case, where the financial regulators, the SEC, in this case, they were the instigators, and they wanted to combat the practice of greenwashing, right? So they came up with this new legislation that they were proposing. And because of that, real estate players, they had to look at challenge their methods and start looking for innovative solutions so that they could keep up, right? Because they realized they were way behind the curve. And in this case, once you create that demand, you get an ecosystem where entrepreneurs come in, they try to come up with solutions, and then that gets funding, right? Venture capital funding. So you need an instigator to really set in motion that entire cycle, and then it should become self-reinforcing.
Nice. Thank you.
I'm not sure anybody could stand up hand on heart and say that they do not have to lead. I'm not sure it's on any of us to point to anyone else and say it's your job to lead. I mean, I think it's a natural instinct to think about who else has the power or who else has the influence. But I think at some level, this is a self-ownership thing of saying, well, not whose responsibility is it to lead, but more how can I lead? What is my influence? What leadership can I show? In whichever sphere I happen to have. I mean, I've got a platform here. I get to lead. That raises the stakes a little bit on what's considered enough leadership, because, you know, there are people who listen. But similarly, the person who gets on the phone to their pension manager and says, I want to move my pension from this fund to that fund, and it's not that big a pension, but every dollar counts, that person is leading. And so too is the person who decides to buy an electric vehicle rather than an internal combustion engine vehicle. And so too is the person who chooses a second-hand car or a second-hand coat from an op shop. I mean, leadership looks different in many different ways. So I think it's on all of us.
Fully agree and concur with that. And if I take, like, many of these statements are around the consumers, and Balsam, you've carried out recently a study, a behavioral study. What are the key findings from that?
So what we did find out from this study is that people are willing to change, people want to change, and 9 out of 10 people, so that's a 90% rate of people that are concerned about climate change.
And this is for the Middle East?
That's for the Middle East, and it did cover part of the UK as well. So, but it's predominantly the Middle East that was surveyed, yes. But what we also found out is that people starting doing their own changes at an individual level. So some of the numbers just to share with you is that 49% of them have reduced their energy consumption and 40% have reduced their water consumption in the last year. So this means that people are willing to change, they want to change. Our role is to provide the solutions for them to change because the solutions are out there, we know them, we're experts in this field. There are affordable, practical, workable solutions that are out there. We just need to see the way to implement them. And by implementation, I'm speaking about the building sector, I'm speaking about the resources sector, so the water, the energy, the waste, and also the transport sector and everything that's connected to it. So it's like integrated solutions, addressing all of the sectors, addressing all of the markets to answer to the different concerns that we've picked up in our survey.
And is there a higher willingness to pay for the green premium?
As long as it returns, as long as there's a low ROI, yes, there is. So there's always what you pay first versus what you get down the operational stream. So we do see that, yes, there is willingness. And yes, there's more awareness as to the importance of getting back what you've paid for higher at the beginning through the lifetime of your building. Obviously, the solutions that we're speaking of are solutions that do have quick return on investment. We're not speaking about anything that's 25 years or more. So yes, so as long as it does make sense for it to be implemented, people are willing to make that first investment cost as long as they do start seeing the fruits of it out in the near future.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. I'll turn to the audience if there is any question. Please, we need to pass on the mic. Can you?
The question, Yahya, will be to you, if you allow me. I would like to have you as a leader for the ESG Plus platform, and its platform to monitor the governance, the social and environmental performance. So, and its topic is leading on the digital practice and the twin. How we and all the challenges happening in the background, climate change, environmental challenge, all this happening. How do you find this tool useful from your business perspective? To when can you advise your clients to, and how to do that? And is there an appetite for this in your monitoring exercise? And if there is not, or how to create the appetite, and if there is, how to push it forward and make it bigger? So, yeah, and if you allow me, you can answer this. Thank you.
Yeah, sure. I'll be brief, and then I'll hand it over here to the team. So from where I'm sitting is that the main trigger for that is coming from the financial institutions requesting ESG compliance and requesting high ESG rating, and we're seeing that also from sovereign wealth fund, whether it's announced or now it's in the process of making, and this will have the highest ripple effect on the economy. What's great in the region specifically is the ESG framework is coming to complement the national visions, whether Saudi Vision 2030 or UAE 2071. So this is all coming together to bring in the private sector with the government to fight for this, for the environmental challenges that we have. Anything to add?
In addition to the financial side of things, which is probably the most important one, is that in terms of positioning and in terms of what our clients' base demands from us, ESG is becoming a priority. So it's a way of commitment. It's a way of you undertaking your environmental, your social, and your governance responsibility to the best of what's applicable to your own operations, because you know that ESG could be tailored to whatever your culture allows, whatever your operation allow, whatever your your organization permits, and that's the importance of it. Plus the fact that it helps you position yourself towards your client in terms of your seriousness to undertake those commitments. And this is being a lot in demand from what we see from clients that are approaching us, the request to have ESG as a reporting mechanism on a yearly basis.
I would just say finally on ESG, we need language to talk about this stuff. Sustainability and climate touches so many things, it's incredibly complex. And we need ways to understand it. We need ways to benchmark. We need ways to be accountable. And because there are so many different sorts of impact, there's no single answer to that. And so ESG gives us a language. It gives us methodologies and mechanisms to count things that are difficult to count, to be honest, because they are complex, they affect people in different ways, they affect systems in different ways. And so we need some way to do it. And it then gets adopted by corporates, by investors, by a range of different players. And it fills an important niche because government does certain things, government can regulate, government can require certain things, government can lead. But ultimately, very few governments are prepared to say we will be the puppet masters of the entire economy. And so if there's going to be a voluntary climate or a voluntary sustainability industry, which there needs to be if government is not going to take it all on, then we need language and we need benchmarks so that those things can be compared. And so I see ESG as like a strongly functional thing that gives us common language for sustainability and climate in the built environment and in corporate affairs.
With ESG, yeah, I think bouncing off of what Richard just said, I think when it comes to when you have all these different ESG requirements and disclosure requirements in different countries with different companies, it's really important that you're. I think it becomes really important that you can do an apple-to-apple comparison, right? So you want to normalize the data, and you're talking about vast amounts of data in order to make that possible. So basically, data normalization, performing basic quality control, all of that is essential. And when you talk about gigabytes of data just for one company, there's no way you can do it manually, right? You need to rely on digital tools, and that's where a digital twin can come in.
Please, one more question.
Yeah, it's more like a comment rather than a question. Everybody's been talking about like renewables and zero carbon and all that, which is like building our new house. We need to think also about the existing house, the old house. So, we have to find solutions that can mitigate, the impacts that we currently have on the environment. So this is very important, not to neglect the current situation that we have. And the second thing is, normally politicians and government, they want quick wins. So long-term solutions and long-term benefits for them, is not like very attractive. So we need also to strike the balance and find like immediate, benefits so that it can make the whole thing succeed.
Thank you for the comment. If from this comment, I go on the next short term, which is COP28. It is in 1 year, and again, it's in the Middle East. What is your one wish for each of you that you would want to see it realized before COP28?
Can we dream? Or okay.
Sky is the limit.
I would say net zero Middle East. I would say maybe a decarbonization roadmap for all of the countries in the Middle East that are unable to commit, unlike others, so that we all align to get to that target. And I would say unlocking finance to make this happen, because it's only this way that will make it actually effectively happen for all of us. And see you in COP28.
One thing by COP28.
She had 3 things, but
Yeah, no, I think I would like to see a change in tenor and tone around transition. I think I started with a slide which said we're in the middle of an urban transition, and I would like to see the language around transition and the thing that we're transitioning to articulated widely by leaders in business and leaders in government within the Middle East, so that we have a renewed vision for a future sustainable Middle East coming out of COP28 in Dubai.
thank you, Faisal.
I think for COP28, the first one is realistic, but maybe a little dull, which is having digital twin interoperability standards. So that would make it much easier for us to integrate with any type of facility and can really boost uptake. The second thing I'd wish for is for a breakthrough in nuclear fusion. But with a breakthrough in nuclear fusion, there won't be a COP28.
Thank you. Thank you all. I would like to thank the panelists. Really thank you for this session, and the audience here, and also the audience that is online. Thank you all, and hope your wishes will be realized. Thank you.